might keep it casual.
Yeah. We're keeping it very casual with literally you rolling on the most embarrassing thing for me. Okay.
Not at all. Not at all.
Hi, everyone. Lisa here from the Here and There Collective. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am thrilled to be in studio with Amanda Phingbodhipakkiya. And I can't wait to see everything there is to see in the studio. But before we do that, would love to just kind of get introduced to you and learn a little about who you are as an artist.
Absolutely. Just right out of the gate, putting me on the spot.
Oh, yeah.
I see how it is.
Yeah, straight. We're straight shooters here.
Love that. So I'm the daughter of Thai and Indonesian immigrants, specifically Indo-Chinese on my mom's side. I feel like a lot of my identity infuses my work in really profound ways. My practice spans sculpture, textile, public art, ritual. Am I missing anything? Very transdisciplinary, as you can see. But I think about my work as creating these portals of renewal and repair, and I'm often harnessing grief and loss and just transmuting that into these liminal spaces that allow us to transform and lay down burdens and really just find connection and repair.
You just listed off all the things and all the ways that you work and you practice, and I'm curious, like, thinking about your journey as an artist, like, where did you begin in that journey?
Oh, that's interesting. I think perhaps I have a more circuitous journey than someone who sort of knew early on and had the opportunity as well to be a contemporary artist. So I actually started in neuroscience, of all places, right? Same.
Yeah. I can see the jump.
But I think that, at least in my work and in my life, I feel like there is a very deep connection. So at the time, I was studying the brain and asking the question, how do we age gracefully? And, we looked at everything from what do you eat, how much do you exercise, what is your socioeconomic status, your education, all that. And what we found actually is it is our social ties that determine how we age, the strength of our social ties. And, after that particular insight, I was like, you know what? I'm actually not meant to be a scientist. I want to cultivate spheres of care in my work. That is how I want to impact the world. And that is now what I do as an artist. So this is actually a 15-foot tapestry that will inhabit Pearl River Mart Gallery. It's this little community gallery in the back of Pearl River Mart. And these are all of the folks that I spoke to inform this body of work. And, we've got Albert, the tailor, Doris, the judge, Lisa and Cindy, and Jonah and Eleanor Ting. But I think what I wanted to capture with this piece is sort of like the shifts in Chinatown, because this work is 2 years in the making. And when I first engaged folks, I wanted to know most about how is Chinatown recovering from the pandemic. And for me, I'm a restaurant kid, so I was immediately drawn to speaking to restaurant owners, to speaking to, pillars of the community who have built Chinatown and continue to sustain Chinatown. But perhaps not in the ways that we might think people build and sustain communities, and how much it's about these quiet revolutions of care where, 20% of folks I interviewed had a devastating fire impact their livelihood. And I heard time and again how the community rallied to care for them. So it's sort of like, this spirit of compassion and care and community that I really wanted to capture in this work.
I love this work in particular because I feel like, living here and growing up here, I recognize so many of these storefronts, but then to see, the people behind that,
Absolutely.
I think it really brings home, to your point, like the sense of community and the people that make the neighborhood what it is.
I think so much of my work is about unearthing unseen labor and kind of highlighting little known stories and narratives. So many things I heard were Chinatown is my heart. Chinatown is a wonderland. Chinatown is a place where you find everything that you're looking for and even the things that you aren't. And I hope that I have, in a way, created sort of like a portal to a wonderland for people.
Clearly, you have such a strong practice in public art, but then obviously we're sitting here in your studio. How do you kind of think about your studio practice in relation to these public art projects? I mean, just kind of thinking theoretically, like they seem like they're different, but clearly there's a through line through you. So just curious how you think about it.
I think I'm interrogating the same themes of the connection between the personal, the cultural, and the systemic. But they're just manifesting in different ways. I think they're part of an ecosystem. For me, they are more like dynamic approaches where the boundaries dissolve. I think very recently my studio practice is sort of like turning inward to kind of investigate sort of like the more nuanced and specific and almost personal shades of ways in which colonialism and imperialism impact us and have bodily and physical psychic impacts. And it's also sort of like trying to parse through what the relationship of personal experiences in these broader power structures. But I think with public art, it's on the scale of the collective. And, most often, definitely, actually every time, I'm going to try to think about a piece of public art where I didn't, where I didn't have participation in some way, whether it's sort of like the piece is up and then I'm inviting you into a frame or a space, or I'm researching for months at a time with community members and, living and working with them to make and create work that is drawn from their legacies, their histories, their experiences. I think participation can happen at any part of the process with public art. This is one of, I feel like, the most interesting pieces in this body of work. It's called What Power Sits in the Telling, and it's interrogating who and what gets to be represented. So it's a mix of objects that one might see or be familiar with in terms of what might live in a museum, like, this clay vase from a historical site, Banchang in northern Thailand, some of these other vessels that were unearthed from the ground in Isan, which is northeastern Thailand. But then there are all these tins that feel very familiar to daily life. And so much of my work is kind of trying to place importance on these quiet moments that sustain our lives, and using materials that folks would be familiar with in their homes, and using them as vessels that carry meaning and can allow for storytelling and transformation. I think one of my favorite tins is the shell can. It's a gas can, and what's interesting is that we know broadly about Shell's human rights abuses, but when you search about Shell's human rights abuses and anything remotely in that vein, you can't find anything in English. And you can only find it very sparingly in Thai. So then we're talking about sort of like these larger systems of power and how capitalism, how imperialism, how all of these forces impact and shape our daily lives.
That's so fascinating, and I can't help but like reflect on your choice of, you know, this sort of vessels that are not the modern everyday vessels, but I can't help but wonder that these were once everyday vessels to some community.
Absolutely.
You know, way back in the day. It just seems like an interesting amalgamation of time and community and, you know, as you're saying, also questions of power.
Absolutely. I think I look at time very much as a proxy for care, because labor that takes time is an expression of care, but also time in terms of history and legacy, where, you know, despite all of this being part of Thai history and legacy, only these objects are considered sort of like, to a Western context, part of Thai history and legacy.
Well, so speaking of materiality, I'm very drawn to this corner of the studio. So enlighten me as to what's going on here.
Oh, the magical, chaotic mess I see has sucked you in. So much of these materials are either scraps from works that have left the studio, or they are materials waiting to be used. And it's just a little bit of my collection. I think it's organized chaos in a way, and I think that is how my practice manifests. I need to see materials and understand how they live in concert with each other, to understand how they might tell a story, or how might they express an emotion or a moment in particular. Much of this is sourced from, these textiles are from Thailand, and also materials for the arts. There's old photographs from around the 1950s that I picked up from an uncle in a night market. What is so interesting about having materials visually with you in a space is that the sourcing journeys of all of these materials are always present with you in the studio. Every time I, for example, look at these beads that were blessed by a monk, I see the monk's face. Whenever I, you know, am looking at this, I think of Eleanor and Jonah Ting, because this is from Ting's, and I think about the shifts in communities because of gentrification, erasure, marginalization, and how sometimes our beloved institutions and communities are no longer there in brick and mortar, but they always live on in our hearts. I can smell the soy sauce that I marinated these chopsticks in to dye them. And I think about all of the labor, all that sweat, heat, grease, you know, and love that is poured into the work of these restaurant owners. And I think about my dad, who I would wait up for at 3 a.m. in the morning, because that is when he came home, from first being, you know, a busboy to finally owning his restaurants. So I think objects are vessels for our own internal exploration, especially when they're placed together and when they're presented in a way where there's tension, precariousness, and something to respond to.
And I think that's such an interesting way to think about the materials in your studio, because oftentimes you think of a studio practice as a very like solitary, alone activity, but just the way you're describing looking at the materials in this room, like you have so much of the community with you.
Absolutely.
Even if you are maybe physically the only one in this space. And I think that's such a interesting way to think about, you know, making work in a studio environment.
I mean, it's so comforting to be buoyed by communities. But I also think that it's a reminder too of my responsibility to, with so much care, express all that these folks generously shared with me.
I love that. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for having us in your space. I really enjoyed getting to learn so much more about your practice and all the stories that sit in this area. And so just wanted to give you a huge thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming through and spending time here.